There's a word you have used your entire life, possibly without ever wondering where it came from. Tractor. It seems like it should be an ancient word. Latin, maybe? Something with roots in the classical world. Like so many of the words we use for things that feel fundamental. And in a way it is. It comes from the Latin trahar, to pull. But the word as we use it today, as the name for a specific kind of machine, was coined in a specific place, by a specific person, in a specific year. Charles City, Iowa, 1906. The company was called Hart-Parr. Most people have never heard of it. But every time someone says the word tractor, every farmer, every implement dealer, every child who has ever pointed at a machine in a field, they are speaking a word that came out of a small Iowa machine shop at the beginning of the 20th century. This is that story. Charles City, Iowa is a small city on the Cedar River in Floyd County, in the north-central part of the state. In 1900, it had a population of around 5,000 people. It had a courthouse, a handful of churches, a few hotels, and the kind of quiet Main Street commerce that defined small Midwestern towns at the turn of the century. It did not seem like the kind of place that would give a new word to the English language. But two young men were about to change that. Charles Hart and Charles Parr met as engineering students at the University of Wisconsin in the mid-1890s. They were both interested in the same problem, the internal combustion engine, and what it might be made to do beyond powering automobiles. Most engineers of the era were focused on making engines smaller and lighter. The automobile was the dream. Hart and Parr were thinking in the other direction. They wanted to make engines bigger, more powerful, heavy enough and strong enough to pull farm implements across open fields. While still students, they formed a partnership and began building prototype stationary gas engines. A university professor named John Butler encouraged their work and helped them think through the engineering problems of large-scale ignition and fuel delivery. By the time they graduated, they had a functioning engine and the outline of a business plan. They needed a place to build their company. Hart's family connections pointed them toward Charles City. In 1901, Hart-Parr Company was incorporated there. They were both 24 years old. The first Hart-Parr factory was modest, a rented space, where the two Charleses and a small crew began producing large gasoline traction engines by hand. The machines they were building were unlike anything most farmers had encountered. A Hart-Parr traction engine of the early 1900s was not the compact, maneuverable tractor that 20th century farmers would come to know. It was enormous, a lumbering, thunderous machine that weighed several tons, moved slowly, and required skill and patience to operate. It was not designed to replace the horse in the field. It was designed to replace the steam traction engine, the massive, coal-fired behemoths that had been doing threshing work on large grain farms since the 1870s. The advantage of the Hart-Parr engine over steam was straightforward. It ran on gasoline or kerosene instead of coal and water. It didn't need a steam engineer to operate it safely. It didn't require carrying water. It was still enormous and slow. But it was, by the standards of 1902, a practical step forward. In 1902, Hart-Parr produced what is generally recognized as the first commercially successful gasoline traction engine in the United States, the Hart-Parr No. 1. It weighed roughly 14,000 pounds. Its single-cylinder engine produced about 17 horsepower at the belt. It was sold to a farmer in Clear Lake, Iowa, and by most accounts it worked well enough that word began to spread. The company grew quickly. By 1905, Hart-Parr had expanded its factory, hired a larger workforce, and was producing traction engines in meaningful numbers for the Great Plains grain market. Charles City, a town of 5,000 people, now had a factory that was building machines for farms across the Midwest and beyond. The community organized itself around the company in the way that small manufacturing towns do. Hart-Parr was the largest employer. Its payroll supported local merchants. His engineers became local figures. The two Charleses became prominent citizens of a town that had become, quietly, a center of American agricultural engineering. In 1906, a Hart-Parr sales manager named Will Williams sat down to write advertising copy for the company's latest engine. He faced a problem that anyone in a new industry faces. There was no clean, agreed-upon word for what he was selling. The machines were variously called gasoline traction engines, gas traction engines, motor plows, or traction motors. Some people still called them just engines. None of these names were wrong exactly, but none of them were right either. They were clumsy. They didn't fit in headlines. They didn't roll off the tongue the way a product name should. Williams needed a word. What he settled on was a compressed combination of the Latin roots, traction and motor. He shortened and merged them into a single word, tractor. It appeared in Hart-Parr promotional materials in 1906. It was clean, it was short, it had classical roots that lent it a certain dignity, and it described exactly what the machine did. It was a motor that provided traction. The word spread with remarkable speed. Within a few years, competing manufacturers were using it. Trade publications adopted it. By the 1910s, it was standard terminology across the industry. By the 1920s, it was in the dictionary. There was some historical debate about whether Williams was truly the first to use tractor in print, or whether the word had appeared in isolated contexts before him. Language rarely has a single clean origin, but the weight of evidence, and the historical consensus, credits the Hart-Parr Company with the first systematic commercial use of the word in a way that drove its adoption across the industry. The machines that built American agriculture have a name. That name came from a sales manager in Charles City, Iowa, who needed a better word for a catalog. Through the first decade of the 20th century, Hart-Parr's machines found a reliable market among large-scale grain farmers on the Great Plains, the kind of operations that needed serious pulling power for threshing and heavy tillage. The company continued to build massive, heavy, single, and twin-cylinder engines that were respected for their durability, if not their elegance. But the market was changing beneath them. The Fordson tractor, introduced by Henry Ford in 1917, weighed around 2,700 pounds, roughly one-fifth the weight of a Hart-Parr. It cost less than $400 at its lowest price point. It could turn in a tight radius. It was designed for the average farmer with an average-sized farm, not for the large-scale grain operation that had been Hart-Parr's core customer. International Harvester, John Deere, and a wave of smaller manufacturers were moving in the same direction. Lighter, cheaper, more versatile machines designed for the row crop farms of the Corn Belt rather than the vast threshing operations of the plains. Hart-Parr attempted to adapt. Through the 1910s and 1920s, they introduced lighter models and tried to compete in the general-purpose tractor market. Some of these machines were well regarded. The Hart-Parr 12 to 25 and later models earned positive reviews for their sturdiness, but the company never fully shed its identity as a builder of heavy, serious iron, and that identity was increasingly out of step with where the market was going. By the late 1920s, Hart-Parr was struggling. Its market share had eroded. The costs of competing against larger manufacturers were mounting. The two founding Charleses had long since stepped back from active management. Charles Hart had left the company as early as 1905 under circumstances that were never fully publicized, and Charles Parr had departed by the 1920s. The company that had named the tractor was running out of road. In 1929, Hart-Parr Company was absorbed into the Oliver Farm Equipment Company, the same consolidation. That brought together Oliver Childe, Plow, Nichols, and Shepard, an American seeding machine company, into one of the largest agricultural equipment firms in the country. The Hart-Parr name survived for a few years on Oliver tractors built in Charles's City. The machines were badged as Oliver Hart-Parr through the early 1930s, before the Hart-Parr portion was quietly dropped. The Charles City factory continued to operate as an Oliver plant for decades, remaining a significant employer in the town long after the founding name had faded. Charles Parr lived until 1945 and saw the industry he had helped create grow into something that would have been unrecognizable to his 1902 self. Millions of tractors, dozens of manufacturers, machines that could do in a day what a horse-drawn crew took a week to accomplish. Charles Hart died in 1937. He left his own company 30 years earlier, and the historical record on why is incomplete. But he lived long enough to see the word his company had put into the world become the standard term for an entire category of machine in every English-speaking country on Earth. The Charles City factory site is still there. A historical marker notes what happened there. The Iowa tractor industry, in one form or another, traces a line back to that building and those two young men from Wisconsin, who thought the future of the internal combustion engine was not on the road but in the field. Language tends to outlast the things it names. The Hart-Parr Company is gone, as factories have changed hands many times. The two Charleses who started it are long dead, and most people who use the word they put into circulation have never heard their names. But every day, on every continent where people farm, in English, And in the dozens of languages that borrowed the English word, someone says tractor. And somewhere underneath that ordinary word is a small Iowa machine shop. Two young engineers and a sales manager who needed something better than gasoline traction engine for a catalog headline. That is, in its quiet way, as permanent as iron. Subscribe to Old Iron Tractor History. There are more stories like this one. Stories that are hiding in plain sight, and words we use every day in places we've never thought to look.